holding it. So, Jane, what I was going to say before I appreciated the Thornboroughs for their sponsorship was the Ray Cultural Center operates out of the Curious George Cottage. So, anytime you get that little extra tagline. So I don't know if now is going to be the time that you want to share a little information about your organization, but thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you all for coming this evening, and I'll let Jane say a little bit about herself and
Thanks, Lee.
presentation.
Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Thank goodness it's not too cold or too dark yet, right? It's nice out. So my name is Jane Oneail, and I own a company called Culturally Curious. I have a background in art history and in education, a master's degree in both fields. And so I put together this company that specializes in art appreciation programs. So I basically do programs like this once or twice a day. And it makes for a very nice life, and I have 3 little kids, and I get to spend most of the day with them, and then sort of check out and put on my thinking hat again and get to do something like this, which is so wonderful. So I've also been doing this through New Hampshire Humanities for the past 4 years or so. So this is one of my favorite programs because we get to talk about things that are close to home. So again, thank you for coming. And since my background is in education, I would love to have a discussion about any of these works. And a little birdie told me that maybe you guys would like to talk about things too. So this has been sort of set up to be more of a lecture, but if you want to stop at any point and ask a question or point something out, I think everybody here would have fun with that. So I definitely encourage you to do that. So we're going to take a walk through all of this art that has been created and inspired by New Hampshire over the years. Let me give you a very quick preamble. When I was studying art history as like an 18-year-old, I remember thinking all great art had to have been created in Paris or New York. Anything else was irrelevant. And then I come home to New Hampshire. I was born and raised in Manchester, and I was interning at the Courier, and then I worked at the Courier, and then I worked at the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen. And so all of these experiences, I got to know all of these New Hampshire artists, at least by name, if not by recognizing their work. This is an image from the League's annual Craftsman's Fair. And I began to have this deep appreciation of what has been created here over the years. So it's a real pleasure to be able to share that with other people. So I wanted to just give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this next hour together. I've basically broken this into 4 sections. Our tourists are our biggest section because just like in New Hampshire today, they outnumber us, right? So the artists that have just come here to create and be inspired, a few transplants, people who have come and stayed, some true blue granite staters, and I should mention that all of these sections get sort of shorter and shorter, and then finally what's happening here today. And I feel like you couldn't do a program on New Hampshire art without at least one image of the old man on the mountain, so we checked the box. This is Frank Shapley. This is an 1880s painting of the old man. So let's get started with our tourists, artists that were just drawn to New Hampshire because they heard it's beautiful, and sometimes they heard other things, we'll see. We'll just move through these images sort of chronologically, and again, any thoughts or ideas, please feel free to jump right in, interrupt me, raise your hand, whatever you feel comfortable with. So of course, when we're thinking about the earliest tourists, these were artists that were not trained. They probably never set foot in an art class, never set foot in a museum. This is an 1817 tavern sign, so it's the back and the front. These would have functioned like the Golden Arches, telling you to come off the road inside this tavern, have a bite to eat. And we just see an artist here who's proficient, right? Who can paint a nice little cornucopia. This was a tavern that was in, I believe, Plainfield, New Hampshire. So a nice little landscape over here with the Masonic symbols. This is just functional. And this is an artist that probably moved, if not all the way throughout New Hampshire, throughout New England. And that's the case for most of New Hampshire's earliest artists. We don't even know their names. They didn't have formal training. But as we move along through time, we begin to see more artists whose names we learn, who have kind of a signature style. So we're looking at 2 works here by an artist named Zedekiah Belknap. We know a fair amount about him. He went to
Belknap, as in
Belknap.
as in down in
Motors and
Perhaps.
and
That's the name of the
gardening.
the name of the county.
I'm not sure he's from that prestigious a family, to be honest. Because
I'm just curious, because
yeah.
it's a very common name down in that area.
I might have to dig into that, because
I'm just, you know, I apologize for giving you more work, but.
That's what happens every time I have one of these programs. So
We have
it
a
could be,
historian.
he was certainly connected as an artist to some of the state's most prestigious families. This is Kirk Dearborn Pierce from the Pierce political family. This is Sarah Minot Melville from the Melville, sort of prominent family down in Manchester. And you can see that for Belknap, our artist here, he had a certain approach. Do kind of like this hard edge profile of the nose with a dark shadow there. Capture the little sweet details of the clothing, of the curls. Who wouldn't want to memorialize their child looking so sweet,
And
right?
they did this with oils.
Yes, these are oil paintings, yeah. And I just love this little detail right here too, of like that hard edge black outline that's, maybe it's a shadow, but maybe it's just the artist being a little bit sloppy with that black outline there. So we can see, still, it's what, you know, some people might call like folk art or primitive art here. And then that brings us to the Hudson River School. Now, these are formally trained artists that are based out of New York City with exceptional training, exceptional background in the arts. And they're drawn up to New Hampshire, of course, because of the scenery. So this is a painting by the artist Thomas Cole, who is really considered the founder of the Hudson River School, which was not a brick and mortar school, it was a philosophical approach to painting. And so what's really fun about the Hudson River School is that there's a formula to these paintings and you can take them apart so easily. So this is his view of the White Mountains. This was commissioned by, I believe his name was Daniel Wadsworth, and we'll talk a little bit as to why. This is an 1827 painting. But the way you understand these paintings, the way you sort of move through them, is that there's almost always a tall framing device in the foreground. There's usually a little tiny figure, maybe it's an animal, but that gives you this awesome sense of scale. If our figure is this small, this tree must be like 300 feet or something. Usually a sleepy waterway in the middle ground, and then just these incredible vertiginous mountains in the background with a little bit of atmospheric perspective, just to give you a sense of distance there. There's one other really important element to a Hudson River School painting, and that is a blasted tree. And the notion here is that it's been struck by lightning. There's something dangerous about the American landscape, the wilderness, the forest, and especially up here in New Hampshire, because just the year before, there had been a horrible tragedy. Are you familiar with the Wiley family tragedy? Some people pronounce it Willie, right? But the Wiley family tragedy, with the family of 7 plus their 2 hired men in their house up near Crawford's Notch, sort of, where one night there's a horrible storm, they're worried about a rock slide or an avalanche, and they don't know what to do. Should they run for their lives? Should they stay in their house? They opened their Bible on the table, they were praying about it, and ultimately decided to flee. And then they all perished. They all disappeared in this mudslide, and the house was left untouched. And their friends went to go find them a few days later, the Bible's still open on the table. So it was such a horrific tragedy that it captured the fascination of the country. And people began to think, New Hampshire is so dangerous and so wild. We have to send up, you know, these artists are like, I'm gonna go up there and capture it. So the blasted tree back here is about that danger. And that's not to say that Hudson River School artists only painted New Hampshire with blasted trees, but it's an element that really sort of separated the American landscape from the European one, where America is wild, primeval, and untamed, and certainly dangerous. And danger was the name of the game when it came to New Hampshire. So these artists would just come up from New York City. We've got a great book over here that shows how they were dressed when they were like walking around in the mountains up here in the White Mountains. And they wouldn't come with their easels per se, but they'd make these nice little sketches, go back to their studios, make a gorgeous painting from that, and sell it in New York City. Here's one other painting from that same artist, Thomas Cole. This is a view of the White Mountains. I think this is at Crawford's Notch, and this is at the National Gallery down in DC. So this was, I mean, the early 1800s version of Netflix. This was as dramatic as it could get because we've got our little rider, right, a major sort of framing element in the foreground, and we've got a storm coming in. And it's like, is this little guy gonna get home before the storm takes him out? This was all the drama. And of course, we've got the gorgeous foliage and all of that. But the blasted trees in the foreground too, that reminder of just how dangerous it is up here in New Hampshire. So there's generations of these Hudson River School artists who are traveling up from the cities and creating paintings inspired by what they saw. This is an Indian summer morning in the White Mountains by an artist named Jasper Cropsey from 1857. This one's at the Courier Museum, and it's gorgeous. It's worth seeing in person. Again, the fall colors, our tall framing device, our blasted tree, you know, the formula's right there. And then we have these little tiny deer here and a few more over here. And then the little waterway that takes our eye back to these glorious mountains too. I mean, who wouldn't want to travel here after you see an image like this one? And people would see these paintings and just go crazy over the fall colors, just like they do today. So one last Hudson River School painting that I wanted to share with you, and this one's from like a generation later. A German-born artist named Albert Bierstadt, who would paint these mountains on a grand scale. And he had a real flair for the theatrical. So he's also New York City based, but he'd come up here during the summers. And this is his painting called The Emerald Pool, which I believe is about 10 feet across, maybe 6 feet across. It's a major painting. And so after he would execute it in New York City, he would cover it up with theater curtains, sell tickets. People would come into a studio with little opera glasses, and then we'd pull the curtain back and people would ooh and ah and gasp and like stand there for hours looking at this painting that it was just overwhelming in scale. I mean, just like a little passage like that could be a painting in its own right. But he gives you the waterfalls, the mountains, the tiny deer over here, and of course the blasted tree, you know. So there's this sense of danger, but at the same time, there is new tourism in New Hampshire. And so we have a sort of a new wave of artists who are also traveling here and documenting that tourism. So this is a painting by Winslow Homer, who is really considered to be America's greatest artist of the 19th century. And he spent a little time up in the White Mountains, the end of the 1860s. I love this painting because it gives us a sense in terms of what it was like for artists to travel around here. We see the backpack, that's where he even has his name right there. The little umbrellas, imagine walking around with your little easel. Yeah, right? And here they are perched on the side of a mountain. They didn't get great weather for it, you know, but you get the sense that they're industrious here and maybe even having a good time. They brought the wine. So it gives us a sense in terms of what it was like to be here around 1870 up in the mountains. I love this little tiny sliver of blue sky right there. So one other painting, oh, and I love this cartoon. It's sort of based off of that same painting. Winslow Homer, this artist, became like a notorious recluse. He just hated other people. So here he makes a little cartoon about somebody hovering behind him, being like a little looky-loo. You can tell he got very annoyed by that sort of thing. So one other image by Winslow Homer is this one here. It's called On the Bridle Path, White Mountains. This is at the Clark Art Institute. And I love this image because, again, it's tourism. People are coming here now, they're experiencing the White Mountains. He's not as concerned about the mountains here as he is concerned about this woman's experience. I love the way this kind of mottled color on the horse kind of corresponds with the rocks below. But this is a woman riding side saddle on the edge of a mountain, right? And it looks as though she's been kind of separated from her group here. So I always think, like, here's the terror. The terror is continuing somehow when it comes to the New Hampshire landscape here. So he gives us a little peek in terms of what it was like to travel to the mountains at the end of the 19th century. But of course, people also come for that little sliver of coastline, and there's the artist Child Hassam, who is considered to be the best American impressionist ever, who was obsessed with the Isles of Shoals. He actually went to the Isles of Shoals every summer for 30 years. He was good friends with the author Celia Thaxter and her famous garden there. So he'd spend all this time painting her poppies and going back to the same view again and again. These are highly prized images. This one is at the Met, this one's at the National Gallery of Art, and you can see how the Impressionist style really lends itself to these views, especially like the riot of flowers here in the foreground. Really makes you feel like you're right there. There's this wonderful immediacy to it. So he also came a little inland. Childe Hassam went around Newfields and Portsmouth. This is one of his watercolors from Portsmouth. This is also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And what's kind of funny about this, I mean, it's a beautiful watercolor in its own right. He loves this federal style architecture, but he added something to this view that didn't exist there. And it was the little steeple. He just thought, it's a New England town. It's gotta have this little punctuation mark right there. I guess he knew what would probably sell. One last two images from Childe Hassam here are two more views of Portsmouth. Maybe some of you have been to the Portsmouth Athenaeum, which is right in Market Square. It's a private library, but you can tour it. So if you haven't done it, I highly recommend it. It's a very colorful place. And then this is just the backside of some warehouses in Portsmouth, right up on the water. These are probably $1 million properties right now, but this is a good segue for us because I'm going to introduce you to another tourist who came to New Hampshire not for the beauty. We're in the 20th century now. We're going to switch formats too. We're going to look at some photography. And the artist here, the photographer, is Lewis Hine. Yes. And he was hired by the National Child Labor Committee to travel up and down the eastern seaboard, documenting as many cases of child labor as he could find. This was really dangerous work because you can imagine people who owned big manufacturing mills did not want anybody disrupting their processes. They didn't want to lose cheap child labor. So Lewis Hine, his life was threatened. He was beaten up for doing this work. Sometimes he would wear disguises. And people were very skeptical of him and his work. So he came to New Hampshire in 1909 and sort of went around Manchester trying to document cases of children working in the mills. I love this image here because, well, it's beautifully framed by that archway there. But you get the sense that it's quitting time, it's the end of the day, and all the adults are kind of like trudging up this hill, they're all exhausted, and the kid still has boundless energy. It's the mother of an 8-year-old, I can tell you this is very true to life. So in addition to trying to get into the mills, he would just interact with kids as much as he could. This is this wonderful photo that he took in Manchester of all of these little boys. And you can see that they're kind of from different classes. But this boy in the foreground who's smiling at us, Lewis Hine established some rapport with him and documented his name and how long he's been working in the mills. And one of the really fun things for me about giving this presentation all over the state is that people contribute their knowledge to it all along. And so somebody said, oh, I was doing research on the mills and I know what happened to this little boy, Fred Normandin. And I was like, oh, tell me. She said, he stopped showing up to work shortly thereafter. And I was like, well, he's a kid. What do you expect? So one last image from Lewis Hine that I wanted to share with you was taken inside the mill building. And I think that this is such a stunning photograph. I mean, it looks like it could be on the cover of Vanity Fair, right? These kids are posing so hard. I love these very self-assured little boys with their arms crossed. I love these two girls and the symmetry that they create here. And as a mom of 3, the fact that all of these kids have their eyes open and are actually looking at the camera is nothing short of a miracle. So incredible images that really help to change like the nature of the workforce in America and create these more benevolent laws for children. So we have that to be proud of. Our next tourist was also somebody who went to Manchester, and it was the preeminent industrial landscape painter, Charles Sheeler. He had made a name for himself out in Michigan painting the automotive factories, and so the board of the Currier Museum decided to invite him to Manchester. And he kind of puttered around for 2 weeks and then ultimately created this oil painting in 1948, this view of those mill buildings downtown. And he gives us this precisionist view of the mills. You could look at little sections of this and it just looks like geometric abstraction. it hardly looks like ornate Victorian mills in any way. Now, the strange thing about this was that the mills had been shut down for more than a decade at this point. They were covered with vines, there were trees growing out of chimneys, but it gives us this very clean, kind of austere look at the mills, which is so wonderful because now they kind of look more like this today. So it's an image that kind of almost changes in some ways as the city itself changes alongside it. So we have just, I think, maybe one last tourist here, and this is an artist who's still alive today, a photographer named Justin Kimball. I believe he is on faculty
That's
at
a
Amherst
photograph?
College. Yes, yes, and one of his photographic projects was to go around New England and document natural spaces that have been impacted by human usage. And I'm sure everybody in here knows a little bit about that. Glorious spaces that everybody just needs to experience for themselves. So this is Deep Hole, New Hampshire in Gilsum. And if you have good eyes, there's about a dozen people waiting to jump off this ledge here. And if that happens all day long, of course this landscape is going to change. It's not going to be that pristine spot that everybody wants to see every summer. So that was really his focus there. And it gives us a sense in terms of how tourism is kind of changing, at least the way artists are documenting it.
Did he use a fuzzy lens?
Does he use a fuzzy lens? No, I think
It
this
might
might
just
be
be
a
the
little bit.
projector.
I don't think
So let's turn our attention to just a few artists that have traveled to New Hampshire over the years and decided to stay. So this is our little preview of Maxfield Parish, if you're a parish lover. But the first artist I wanted to introduce you to is Edmund Tarbell. And if you've been to the Courier, you've probably seen this absolutely gorgeous image from right around 1904. This is Summer Breeze, and it just makes you feel like you want to put on a white dress and stand by the seaside and just, stand there, with your dress billowing in the breeze. It's just these gorgeous blues. This is Edmund Tarbell. He was a leading Impressionist artist right around the turn of the century, working in Boston, teaching in Boston. He had this great life, but he up and decides to move to Newcastle, New Hampshire with his wife and 4 kids. And they had this incredible house right on the water. And from that point on, his work really just turned inward. He was really only painting his family for the most part. This is his daughter Mercy cutting flowers. This is a painting that's also at the Courier. It's painted at around 1911. And it's a gorgeous image. And we can sort of see how he moves back and forth between Impressionism and realism. Look at how loosely he's painted the flowers here and even the walkway. But look at the way he's painted her face. There's a real naturalism there. There's a realism there. And her hands. That's where our focus is supposed to be, right? It was always really fun to show this image to kids when I worked at the Courier, because we'd say, do you know what she's doing? Do you know what they'd always say? Checking her phone. That's how we all look, right? So Edmund Tarbell's images are, they always just remind me of like life in the time of COVID. It's just these kind of quiet scenes of people reading, playing games, writing letters, but it's all just contained within inside his house. And these are sought after images. I don't quite remember off the top of my head, but these are both in collections down in Washington, D.C. One of them is at the State Department. So still very highly regarded. Now, sadly, this is a quick tangent. That beautiful house that he lived in, after the artist passed away in 1936, that huge house was subdivided down into apartments, and his children, who grew up there, were renting out the apartments. And as it turns out, one of my old colleagues, this wonderful woman, after working several years at the Courier, suddenly realized that she had once rented one of those apartments. She even had a photograph of her living room. And she said, "Oh, Jane, I feel like such a fool because I had no idea who Edmund Tarbell was." And so here she was, like touring the building, looking at the apartment, and in every single room, there's like a stunning painting like this. And my old colleague said, and I kept going around being like, "Is this a John Singer Sargent?" And they were like, "No, this is Edmund Tarbell's house." So sadly, this house did burn down in 2016. It was like a 2-alarm fire, but it was the same
With
year
the paintings inside?
I don't believe there were any paintings inside, because there was also a major exhibition of his work at the same time, and a monograph. So I think at the very least, a lot of the history was saved and preserved because of that exhibition, thank goodness. So another important transplant that I'm sure you've all heard of before is Augustus St. Gaudens. He was born in Ireland, actually emigrated to the US, and then eventually started to come up to New Hampshire from New York City and spend his summers here up in Cornish. And that has helped to establish, of course, the famous Cornish colony, where you have dancers and musicians and sculptors and painters all coming up because of the creative environment that he had helped to establish here. He had bought this old brothel and turned it into this beautiful home, which is now a National Historic Site. And he really established his practice here. And we have so much to be proud of, because he created so many really iconic sculptures while he was up here in New Hampshire. He eventually moved here full time. But you've probably seen the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial down on the edge of the Boston Common. And this is, this is a sculpture that we should all be proud of, because it's actually the first public monument that pays homage to the military service of African Americans. So this is a Civil War scene with all of these African American soldiers marching down south, and each one of them depicted with, you know, humanity and their own individual dignity. And it's really wonderful. I think that that the artist who created this was working right here in New Hampshire. This is obviously like sort of an allegorical figure that's kind of sending them off. So other works that he created while he was here, he became very famous for these sculptures of Abraham Lincoln. And a couple of decades after the Civil War, Lincoln was this very unifying figure. But one thing I've learned through these talks was that he was a very strange looking man. I gave a talk at the Exeter Old Town Hall, and before I went up on the stage, the woman who was hosting said, Abraham Lincoln stood there and he talked to the students from Phillips Exeter, and they were all so thrown by what a strange looking man he was. But he was such a great orator that he just won them all over. So that was the line that Augustus St. Gaudens had to toe. Like, how do I capture what Abraham Lincoln really looked like, the strangeness that really affected everybody, but also the dignity, the intellect, the ability to speak. And he sort of combined these things in his sculptures. I love this one here where he's seated, he's deep in thought, and you can see his toe just kind of coming over the edge of the pedestal. It's almost like he's about to rise and say something that's gonna knock our socks off, right? And it was his neighbor in Cornish who was the model for these sculptures. So always a New Hampshire connection. One last work that he created while he was living up here in New Hampshire is this monument, which was created for someone's tombstone. The actual tomb is down in Maryland, but there are copies of this at the site in Cornish. So this was a tomb that was created for the Adams political family. There was a wife who had passed away due to suicide, so it was a grief that the family was experiencing that was so hard to sort of wrap their minds and their hearts around. And this monument here, I think, sort of speaks to their grief and sort of the torture, the emotional torture of the woman who passed away. It's such a haunting figure here. It's actually known as grief too. And as you're approaching it, she's so heavily shrouded, you almost don't know what you're going to encounter. And then you get a little bit closer and you see this sadness, this deep melancholy in the face that I think it's just an incredibly impactful, moving sculpture. So we're going to switch gears from grief to ecstasy. That is the name of this work, and it was done in 1929, I'm guessing before the stock market crash. So this is Maxfield Parrish. He and his family were living down in Philadelphia. They were coming up to the Cornish colony. They were connected to Augustus St. Gaudens, and of course, Maxfield Parrish had this integral role in the golden age of illustration in the United States, the first half of the 20th century. And so he decided, we're gonna stay in New Hampshire, and they moved to Plainfield, and he became really one of the best known artists in the country. Life magazine did a survey of Americans. They asked Americans, who are your favorite artists? And I think this was back in 1936. And Americans said Vincent van Gogh, Paul Cézanne, and Maxfield Parish.
Wow.
This image here was reproduced so widely that it was estimated that 1 out of every 4 houses had a replica of this image. This is called Daybreak. It's from 1922. Wrap your brain around what people would have been so enthused by. So it's a neoclassical image like so many of his. We've got the classical columns, we've got the figure in a toga here, and then this nymph-like little creature is the embodiment of the sunshine, the daybreak, the morning light, and is leaning over this figure as they first wake up. It's a nice thought, right? But I mean, 1 in 4 houses, come on. Maxfield Parish was really well known for these saturated colors, and there is this special quality of light that he used in his images. The way he illuminates the side of like this very craggy rock face. It's a light that you really see in New Hampshire. I always see it usually around September. If you like have dinner outside and the sun's setting, it's Maxfield Parish light. And then we've got the canopy of trees. So it's a lovely image. I mean, what's not to like about the image? And it's inspired so many other works over the years from popular culture. We've got a Princess Bride movie poster, and it's a Maxfield Parish ripoff. Believe it or not, Michael Jackson even ripped off a little bit of Maxfield Parish in a very awkward video for one of his songs. That's his wife there, Lisa Marie Presley. So it's pretty incredible to think that, you know, this work by this New Hampshire artist had that kind of effect. So his home is still there in Plainfield. This is actually a replica of his home, which also burnt down. And this is the view from that house, this beautiful mountainscape, which found its way into so many of his paintings too. So the property that he lived on was called the Oaks. It has these massive oak trees, like 19 feet in diameter. That's this outbuilding over here was his studio. And I was giving this program over Zoom a couple years ago, and I said, this property's for sale right now. It's listed for about $750,000. And at the end of the Zoom, somebody said, oh, by the way, I got that property for a lot less than that. And he just bought Maxfield Parish's house, and he said, I'm gonna turn it into an Airbnb, and anybody who wants to come up and see it is more than welcome to do so. So I took advantage of that. It's pretty incredible. I don't know if it's actually an Airbnb though now, but you can probably find him and wander around if you wanted to see it yourself. So just a few more images from Maxfield Parish, that incredible light, the way we see the trunk of that tree, the branches all illuminated. Another daybreak image. This one's at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. The way he illuminates the side of the barn there too. It's that special quality of light that I think makes these little New Hampshire scenes, these little vignettes, just so inviting, so warm. So if you get up to Plainfield, you can go to the town hall, and Maxfield Parish actually painted the stage sets in town hall. So you could just climb up on that stage and you know, spin around, pretend you're in a Maxfield Parish painting. I'm doing just a program on Maxfield Parish next May, I believe it is. And so I'm working with the librarian in Plainfield so that we can do it right there in that building, which will be a lot of fun. All right, just 2 true Granite stagers. Yes?
Yeah, I understand that he also did the stage curtains in Danbury, New Hampshire.
Oh, really? Oh, so
I haven't seen them.
That
I'd
going
like
to place to place.
They do have a farmer's market, so even in the winter, so it's possible you might be able to see it.
I'll have to look into that. Good to know. Thank you. So this could be a very long list too, but I just have 2 artists for us. The first is John Brooks. He is a New Hampshire furniture master, and his works of furniture and sculpture are in museums worldwide. He is very much alive today. Born in Manchester, he lives in New Boston, New Hampshire. We have a sense here in terms of what his design aesthetic is. He creates these pieces of furniture that look like they could get up and walk away. So this is what his house looks like. He usually does an open house every year. And it kind of looks like a little fairy house. You go inside, and it's definitely the home of a woodworker. Yeah, right. And you can see some examples of his work here. When I should mention fire again. He was getting ready for a retrospective at the Courier back in 2010, and his entire studio burnt down. And the arts community in New Hampshire just rallied around him, and now there are all these artist emergency grants that exist for people in similar circumstances. But it's pretty amazing that fire is like the continuous thread here. So some of John Brooks's earlier work from the 1970s or so, it's kind of big and chunky. You get the sense that it's carved right out of the trunk of a tree. But more recently, he basically just walks out of his door in New Boston, goes into the woods and collects sticks and branches. Sometimes the shape appeals to him, and sometimes he sort of bends and molds those shapes, so that he's creating sculpture that kind of looks like furniture now, covering it in glyphs, looks like a ladder-back chair, but of course you can't sit in it. And then these dogs, I mean, it's pretty amazing to think that these dogs' legs are just branches from trees in New Boston. So it's all kind of whimsical, it's all kind of fun, very appealing. Our other true granite stater here is an artist named James Aponovich, who was born in Nashville, lives in Hancock, and he specializes in a high degree of realism. This is a self-portrait from 1989, and this is what more or less what he looks like today. This is a work that's in the collection at the Courier, and it was always so much fun to talk to groups about this work with them, because once you look past him, you can see all the sorts of things that inspired him, and you can find shapes that he's using again and again, references to his family and to other sources. So there's a lot to kind of dive into with an image like this. This is another work that's at the Courier. It's called Still Life with Chocolates, and it's such a high degree of realism that it's almost surrealism. Like everything is in focus, and of course that's not how we actually see the world. But they're a lot of fun to kind of unpack. He sort of has fun with reflective surfaces, the repetition of shapes and forms and that sort of thing. And growing up in Manchester, I mean, he was going to the same fabric stores as my mom, apparently, because like, we had curtains out of the same material. So it was really fun for me as a kid, seeing things that were so familiar in an art museum. So these days, he's got like a formula that he's really sticking to for the most part. A floral still life, a swag of drapery, and a landscape in the background. We've got Appledore Island over here, so the Isles of Shoals again. And then I just had to show you this one. This is Italy, but the peonies are gorgeous. And then you can actually see him here in the reflection on the vase and the edge of the canvas that he's working on. So, I mean, he just does all of these little flourishes just to make your jaw drop. He recently collaborated with David Lamb, another New Hampshire furniture master, who did all of the casework, and then Aponovich would paint these panels inside the piece of furniture. This was kind of the culmination here. So these veneer panels open up into this incredible panel painted by James Aponovich, and it's the White Mountains, and it's lilacs, and it's apples. It's all things New Hampshire here. Quite the collector's item. So we're going to turn our attention now, we'll just wrap up very quickly with just a few artists that are working today in New Hampshire. And of course, the name of the game is innovation. So the first artist I wanted to quickly introduce you to is Sue Sunny Park. She is a professor at Dartmouth and lives in Cornish. And her specialty is taking industrial materials and transforming them to look as light as air, and then creating these spaces that seem almost otherworldly. So this is an installation she did called Unwoven Light, and it's just industrial chain link fencing that is bended and molded, and then she includes these little iridescent tiles in them and illuminates it in such a way that you want to walk into this shiny cloud that she's created, right? There's something incredibly, I mean, alluring about this. One other sculpture by her, or installation, this one's called Vapor Slide. This is chain link fencing, and she just pushed plastic cups through those holes, and there are rocks hanging off of strings here. I mean, it's strange, but it is mesmerizing, isn't it? I look forward to the day where I can experience one of these. Kathleen Dustin is a member of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, and most people think of like League of New Hampshire Craftsmen and like wood turning, but she works in and polymer clay. And she sort of specializes in this is like her signature piece, this necklace, that looks like rocks and stones and wood, but it's all clay. It's very light, it's very playful. So she's inspired by nature, certainly, and I should say she teaches all over the planet. She's just a very highly regarded artist in her field. She also made purses for a while. I love this flower purse. I guess she was commissioned to do this for someone's very elaborate wedding, where instead of the bridesmaids carrying bouquets, they all had their own signature Kathleen Dustin purse, which kind of pops open like that. Nice memento. These sorts of things are in museums now. This looks like a rock with an apple. It's polymer clay, and it is a purse. So,
What, well, I don't want to sound too stupid.
Yeah.
I know what clay is,
Yep.
and I know what a polymer is.
Yeah.
What is polymer clay?
Polymer clay, that's a good question. I
Am
don't
I
know if
asking a stupid question?
No, I don't know if I have a great answer for you, but I'm assuming it's clay that you can.
I mean,
Yeah,
I know
it
what a
is.
polymer
It's plastic.
A moldable.
Yeah.
Except that's not what,
Malleable.
molded plastic is not clay. You know what I'm saying?
No,
I
but
don't-
Well, it does
I mean,
the
I mean,
function of clay.
I mean, I'm not an art person, so I'm just trying to put the two, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I
don't know
think
if
it's a
that's-
lighter version of like Sculpey, like it doesn't
Yeah.
stick
Yeah.
like
Yep.
Sculpey does, but
Yeah,
it-
are you familiar with Sculpey clay?
Or
I'm not
female.
familiar with.
Yeah,
clay.
right.
Except
We don't
that-
do clay.
except
Well-
what's in the ground, right?
Yeah.
We'll
Right.
bring some to the preschool, you can come over.
Yeah, you can get some Sculpey. That's the next
It's
program.
not
We'll all
Play-Doh,
get some
I know that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Better
it's
than
Play-Doh, that I know.
I think
Um,
the colors are very intense
Yes.
with
Yeah.
the polymer clay.
Recently, Kathleen Dustin was exhibiting at the Smithsonian Craft Show, and she sold a necklace to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which I know was like a high point in her career. Kathleen Dustin's, I don't know if it was a high point in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's career, but one other political figure here as our transition is Governor Sununu, here with an artist that specializes in silicone mask making. So this is high-end silicone mask making. The artist here is Jeremy Oneail. It's actually my husband. And so he makes these incredibly realistic masks that are sort of like from Mission Impossible when they tear off a
Yeah.
face and you didn't know they were wearing a mask. He also makes monster masks too,
Yeah.
so he's very busy in the month of
Yeah.
October.
October.
So I think of him as having like a Renaissance man set of skills because he has to create a clay mold of whatever face he's going to sculpt, including all of those wrinkles and the saggy lines and all of that. And then he has to cast it in silicone, and then he has to paint it and punch in individual hairs. So he gets requests for these masks from museums, from amusement parks, from clients all over the world, occasionally from
Celebrities?
yes, actually, if you're familiar with the celebrity Ron Perlman,
Yes.
they were doing some sort of promo for some movie that he was doing. So Amazon or Netflix got in touch with him, and he had to do 30 Ron Perlman masks. And then we have all the
Wow.
pictures of Ron Perlman with the Ron Perlman lookalikes. But then like private eyes will get in touch with him and they'll say, I'm staking out somebody that I need to serve, and so I'm gonna wear a mask. I can't tell you how many people who have been catfishing someone online try to buy a mask because they think that they can sort of fool someone in person. But every now and then somebody like the Indianapolis Colts gets in touch and they put an old man mask on their kicker who like sort of goes out to the midfield and then kicks a perfect field goal. So my husband always has incredible stories of who's wearing the masks and why. Somebody did commit a federal robbery wearing one of his masks. They robbed a post office.
And he
Yeah.
wasn't considered a,
No, but I mean, the crazy thing is that they bought like a one-of-a-kind mask
Wow.
in order to do it. It was like a $400 mask. And they knew he was wearing a mask because at one point he lifted up his shirt to show a gun and his belly was a different color than his face. So they tracked it down to my husband, who had to go testify in federal court,
Yeah.
like, I made that mask. And my husband was just like, why didn't you just put some pantyhose over his head? It would have been a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
So never a dull moment with my husband, let me tell you. But one last artist I was going to introduce you to, and that is Vivian Beer. She is also a Manchester-based industrial designer. Here she is sitting in some examples of her furniture. Would you be bold enough to sit in a chair that looks like liquid paint? She was
Did she
commissioned.
do the shoe?
Oh,
Yes, yes.
She was commissioned by
Yes.
the Courier to create
Yeah.
a sculpture in response to something in the collection. And I don't think anyone could have anticipated the fact that she would make this huge, sexy sculpture that kind of looks like a stiletto meets a chaise lounge. It's hard to know. And it's candy apple red, you know, it's this automotive paint. And the object that inspired her for this was just this little leg here on, on an antique chest on chest. So she's very innovative, and actually she won a $100,000 prize in the Ellen DeGeneres Design Challenge. So I'm sure we will see a lot more from Vivian Beer. So we'll wrap up very quickly just by saying, you know, we've seen these gorgeous landscapes, some of them idealized, and some of them real depictions of life in New Hampshire. We've seen these ethereal landscapes that were really created to kind of stir our souls, sometimes using innovative materials and sometimes using very traditional materials. We've seen artists touching on subjects that artists have explored for centuries. And once again, innovation all along the way. And then finally, we've seen a couple of examples of artists who are exploring really the potential, the expressive potential of the human body. And so when it comes to art making, in New Hampshire, there is no shortage of artwork for us to be so proud of. Now, it's not New York and it's not Paris, but there's certainly some incredible art making traditions here in New Hampshire that we can all be, like I said, very proud of. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about the images we saw.
That was really interesting. Yeah.
Just one local comment, someone who many people may know, a guy named David Batchelor, who's a very, very well-known photographer, was hired by the National Gallery to do the pictures of St. Gaudens in Cornish. And he did that many, many years ago. And he lived in Campton for years and became a photographer. And now he's become very, very famous by sort of nouveau art, where he takes pictures of the tidelands, it's called, where water comes up over the sand, goes back. He's got 4 published books, and he's just recently did a 100th anniversary showing in Berlin, where the first times a tideland was ever done over 100 years ago, and he went and showed his paintings there. So he's a New Hampshire artist who
Very local,
who's
yeah.
become quite well known and gravitated from taking pictures of gardens for the National Art Gallery, whatever, to impressionistic type of stuff.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Dave Batchelor.
Bachelor.
David Batchelor, if you look under Tidelands, he's got 4 books. It's very sharp about stuff.
Another local is Skylar Matthews, and the Campton Historical Society has some of his original work. They also sell note cards, and he's the one who has done some amazing field books of plants, and he'll refer to the bees and talk about the bog in Campton, because he had he lived in Plymouth in the summer, but he had a school in West Campton, I think, and I was
An art colony there.
an art colony. I wonder if you knew anything about that.
No, I'd have to look into that. Thank you for sharing.
There's another
Skylar Matthews. Okay.
funny connection with Lincoln and New Hampshire artists, because Lincoln's secretary, John Nicolet's daughter, was a painter, and she painted paintings on Rye Beach and all around. And she also wrote A Boy's Life of Lincoln. She's an author as well, but very interesting.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
And the woman that did the industrial chain link fence,
Yes.
work,
Sue Sunny Park.
Susan.
Yeah, SOO.
Korean.
She made me think of Ruth Asawa's work, the tiny wire,
Yeah.
things that she put together in the geometrical shapes, so she must
On a
know.
grand scale.
Oh my gosh, yes, yeah.
My wife and I just recently went to see Thomas Cole's home in Catskill, New York.
Yes.
And I was especially intrigued with the way you broke down the essentials of the Hudson River
Mhm.
School as to what to look for. And one thing I was curious about, in some of those that you showed, the first one with the snow-capped pyramidal shaped peak, I've always suspected that he exaggerated that. And and a couple others you showed, I wondered if, in order to sort of bring out the awesomeness and sort of both fearsomeness and mystique, that they took a bit of artistic license in dramatizing.
I think you are 100% spot on. Although, tonight was my first time ever in Waterville Valley, and the feeling that I had just driving in here, it's incredible. And so even though it does feel like an exaggeration when you
Yeah.
look at those
Yeah.
images, like just my experience today, it's like there's this sense of awe that is so hard to capture, so maybe you just have to make those mountains look a little bit bigger.
Well, ironically, I'm guilty of that, because when I was about 15, I did an oil painting
Last
of
year.
a beautiful scene. It was from a photo in National Geographic of the Northern Cascades. And I of course, always try to do things literally and exactly, because that's the way I am. But the snow-capped peaks looked too boring. And so I actually made them higher than they're supposed to be. And I've been feeling guilty about that for 4 or 5 years now. But I see that I have good precedent.
Exactly. You're standing on the shoulders of geniuses. I mean, I stopped, I took pictures tonight and I sent them off to my husband. And I'm like, obviously these don't do these mountains justice. I mean, it's just so beautiful here. But I love that story.
But that was really interesting to see the different components to look for. In these
Oh yeah, once you know the formula, you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I see it. It's pretty obvious. And then it's kind of fun to see like who diverges from that.
Well,
because-
that's what I was
right?
gonna really,
Yeah.
investigate Susie here and.
I mean, just what I saw in the book, because Susie Barstow, sorry, I didn't get your name, but
Becca
Becca
Hastings.
brought in this book by, that features the work of a female Hudson River School painter who came up to New Hampshire. And wait till you see what she wore to hike the White Mountains, the
Yeah.
presidentials. But her work kind of deviates from that formula,
Mhm.
so it's interesting to see.
Maybe she wasn't trying to lure tourists.
She wasn't as concerned with
She
like
was a little later,
instilling
yeah.
fear.
In fact, she was criticized because Hudson River School was sort of,
Already
old
passé,
school
yeah.
passé.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And
so-
she
yeah.
was coming into her own art, so.
Yeah. Yeah, they were really big there for a while and then, yeah,
Mhm.
you gotta let it go.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you
that's
so
really
much.
nice. Again, appreciate you
That
coming
was
out.
great, and thank you everyone for making it out this evening. It's good to see
Oh,
familiar faces.
Faces,
Wouldn't miss it.
Yeah, thank you.